All right, this is the second video covering Chapter 2 in the textbooks. This is going to cover the first two main sections in this chapter uh, that lay the groundwork for then describing the different sounds of English in phonetic terms as we see in the IPA, the International Phonetic Alphabet. So I'm going to just step through it quickly, and I'm going to be highlighting what I think you should be paying attention to as you read the textbook and any other materials. So in section 2.1, we talk about phonation of the larynx. Right, the voice box, it's pretty small, but it does a lot of work in speech, so it makes sense that this is the first thing that we're digging into. And we have a lot of terms around the different parts. So we talk about the larynx. This is the voice box itself, the Adam's apple. The trachea, which is the windpipe, where breath comes, below the larynx into the lungs and then back out to the larynx. The vocal folds in there, the things that actually do the vibration and some other tasks in speech. For each of these, we do have different terms, and I've been mentioning a couple of them here. The textbook, I'm going to follow the textbook in treating one of these terms as kind of primary, so larynx, trachea, vocal folds, and then we have the synonyms that are very good to know when you're talking to other people, reading other materials. The term voice box, Adam's apple, these are colloquial terms that generally refer to the same thing as our technical term larynx. Windpipe tends to map to trachea. And the vocal folds are often known as vocal cords. Phoneticians have varying degrees of prickliness about that. They aren't physically like a cord, like the string of a guitar. They're more like folds of flesh that vibrate in a very particular way that we'll learn about in a later section of this course. So we get a basic description in this section of how phonation works. As air flows past the vocal folds, they have this kind of undulating cycle that happens, in some people's voice, 80 to 100 times a second, other people up to 200 or 300 times a second, sometimes a bit higher in very small children, right? So that's phonation. This is a very basic process, and we can feel it happening when we touch where the voice box is, where the larynx is. And I really like the illustration in the textbooks. It's an illustration that I use in teaching a lot, where you try an S sound and a Z sound and alternate between them. So you go and whenever you move into the Z sound, you can feel that vibration, that buzzing. You can feel it in your fingers against the voice box. Another term that we get here is the term glottis. Depending on the context, some phoneticians use this term a lot, some less. But it's really good to know that the glottis refers to the space between the vocal folds. And the main reason that we use that is because the adjectival form of that noun, glottal, is how we describe sounds that are produced there, like the H sound, ha, right, glottal consonants. This section, it mentions some other glottal states that we're going to get to in a later section. But that's the larynx, right? So we've got some very basic anatomical terms. There's a lot more to go on there. We'll get to some of it later in the course. And the basic function that we find in English, distinguishing voiced from voiceless sounds. And then in the next section, we get on to some more articulatory terms of the vocal tract above the larynx. So from our mid-sagittal view of the vocal tract, we have all those labeled structures, and where they have regular everyday terms, I like to use those regular everyday terms, and the textbook goes with the lips, the teeth. We're going to call them lips and teeth. So lips and teeth are technical terms that mean exactly what you expect them to mean. Beyond that, we get the alveolar ridge, the palate, the velum or soft palate, the uvula, pharynx, and the larynx. And each of these becomes, in the next video, the locus for a place of articulation of a consonant. So we're going to need adjectival forms for those. So the lips, the adjective is labial. Labial sounds are produced at the lips. Dental sounds are produced at the teeth. Alveolar sounds at the alveolar ridge. Palatal sounds at the palate. Velar sounds at the velum. The velum is also known as the soft palate, but thinking of it as velum connects to that adjective form velar nicely. Uvular sounds of the uvula, pharyngeal sounds of the pharynx. We don't have uvular and pharyngeal sounds in English, but we'll get to those later. And glottal sounds produced in the larynx. We also in the diagram see the esophagus. So one of the roles of the larynx is as a valve to prevent when you're swallowing drink and food, to close off the windpipe, the trachea, so that the food and drink flows down the esophagus, which is right behind the trachea. And the epiglottis is kind of the cap on that valve. So we learn about that. We also see the tongue in this diagram. Tongue is immensely important for language to the extent that many languages' word for language is the word for tongue, or is derived from an older word for tongue. Even the English word language comes from lingua, Latin word for tongue. And the tongue, we look at different parts of the tongue as well. The tip, the blade, the body, and the root, and some detail about that I'll get you to look in the textbook for the finer grain detail there. We don't often describe sounds by what part of the tongue produces them, because the tongue is always in there, so it's easier to produce them by the other bits in the vocal tract, the passive articulators, because they're more unique to particular articulations. But it is important to know what the tongue is doing. And yes, in this section we also learn about the difference between the active articulator and the passive articulator idea. Some sounds have an active articulator and a passive articulator as primary in the production. Some have two active articulators, and some are more complex than that. So look in the textbook for some discussion on that. And that really sets us up for what we want to do with describing the consonants of English and then describing the vowels of English. So I'm going to stop this video here. We'll move on in the next video to those next sections.